No better way to step into episode 14 than by having the remarkable Jess on the show. Jess's childhood of rich cultural traditions and generational teachings was met with narrow minded and closed off differences. She spoke two languages in her house as a child, and neither one was the mother tongue of the country she grew up in. Navigating the minefield of early adolescence and parental refugee assimilation, she focused on her education to increase her future opportunities and chances. An ultimatum left her and her mum to fend for themselves and change directions in her educational pathway. Though she appreciated the opportunities the surrounds provide, she was destined for a life outside of the golden cage and a return to her cultural roots. I'll be sharing my reflections after the podcast, but until then, sit back and enjoy the integral story of Jess. Jess, thanks for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
My pleasure, my pleasure. Well, let's take it back to the beginning. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in a small town in a canton called Basel-Land in Switzerland.
Wow. Small town. How small are we talking?
Ooh, I should have researched some numbers before jumping on here. I don't know numbers, but it felt very small for me. The earliest memories, I would say, were moving a lot within that canton, so to say. And yeah, I just remember my mom piggybacking me onto her shoulders to walk up the stairs and go to my grandma, which is paternal side grandma. And yeah, she basically dropped me there so she could go to work. And then I would spend the whole day with my grandma, and she would have a little meditation pillow ready for me that she has made. I was able to nap a bit more because my mom would bring me there at around 5:30 or something in the morning. And then I would wake up again at 7, forced to meditate with my grandma, kind of. And yeah, that was basically my everyday in that little small town. So I didn't really see much of that town.
And roughly how old were you at this stage?
That's before kindergarten. So that's like, from infant. I think my mom went back to work a year after she got me, or even earlier, as early as possible, I guess.
Yep.
And before kindergarten, I was spending time with my grandma like this during the week. And yeah, that's basically my everyday, so to say, back then in that little small town.
And spending so much quality time with your grandma, what was your relationship like with her?
I think it was very beautiful, I would say. I appreciated her even more later on. But as a kid, I think I tried to become my own person. But so I was sometimes also fighting with her, I remember. But because obviously she's from a different generation, right? And for her, being in Switzerland had its own challenges as well, language-wise and culturally, for sure. So she had like a very old belief system and traditional upbringing that she tried to put on me, right? Yeah.
And what was her traditional upbringing?
Well, I would say really classic Asian. She's Cantonese, but grew up and was born in Saigon, Vietnam, in like Chinatown, so to say, of Vietnam. Because when she spoke Vietnamese, she would have a Chinese accent, and which means that she hasn't really learned Vietnamese until later on in life because she didn't have to. It's like Chinatown. Yeah.
Wow. And so spending these young formative years with your grandma, apart from meditation, what were the other things you picked up with her?
she cooked a lot. I spent a lot of time in the kitchen. And when I wasn't in the kitchen with her, she would bring me down to the little garden patch that she had. Like they were renting a little apartment, but had a little garden patch as well. So she turned over some potatoes, and I was able to collect them. She planted some flowers in that space, and if I was not doing these things, I was allowed to watch some cassettes, some movies. The Monkey King, very classic Chinese children's thing. And yeah, it's just really beautiful memories if I think about it, because it's so peaceful. I wasn't realizing that there is another world out there, except when I would go on the weekends to my other grandma, that's the mother's side. And there I would then spend time with the other side of the family, the Vietnamese side of the family.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so, did your grandmother on your father's side, did she have any friends or people that she could connect with?
She came to Switzerland in her late 50s, right? And I didn't know of any friends that she had particularly. She had an older sister that was around as well, but in another town, more towards the city. And I felt like it was very secluded. We were living very secluded in that time. Just on the weekends, we would go to see that other side of the family, maybe, or she would be very dependent on people that drove her around because she wouldn't take public transport by herself. So everything, like her world, would be around where she could walk to, or her sons were able to bring her to.
Wow.
Mm.
And so, did you grow up with any brothers or sisters?
No, I am an only child, or was, but that will come on later. Yeah, but I grew up with my cousins, so we are all 3, 4, and 6 years apart, and I would see those cousins from the maternal side every weekend. So they were practically my siblings, or it still feels like they're my siblings.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, just to paint a little bit more of the picture,
Mm.
how did your grandmother make it from the Chinatowns of Saigon in Vietnam to then Switzerland?
So my family, both sides, so my parents met in Switzerland, but they both left Vietnam in 75. So they were part of the first refugees that have arrived in Switzerland after the Vietnam War. And both sides, they left and had to stay a little bit on the island in Malaysia, and for different reasons got to come to Switzerland. Switzerland back then had a pact or contract with the Red Cross. So every family that had a disabled family member was allowed to come to Switzerland. Yeah, that's how they both like parallel came to Switzerland and then met in Switzerland at one of those Vietnamese events, so to say. There were those regular Vietnamese gatherings because there were not many Vietnamese people in Switzerland. So they would gather there and just, meet each other, connect, and from different cities of Switzerland. It would be in a different city every weekend. Does that make sense?
Sure. And who were the disabled family members?
So on my dad's side, it was his cousin, and he had a mental disability. And on my mom's side as well, a cousin, he had polio, and that affected his leg. Yeah.
Wow. Did you ever in the early days, or even with the relationship with your grandma, ask her questions about what it was like living in Vietnam and then having to leave?
Yeah, especially when I got older. As a kid, I didn't think that far, right? She was my grandma. So I just heard stories that she would tell from family members. She had 10 siblings, I think, or 11. Some of them have passed away early on. Some of them after the war have gone to Sweden, to Finland. So I have kind of family members in those areas that I don't even really know about. I've never met them. I don't know their names. I don't know their faces. I don't really know them. And I just knew about the ones, or knew them personally, the ones that were in Switzerland or maybe Germany, somewhere close by.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is it quite traditional to, in Vietnamese culture, Cantonese culture, to actually grow up with your grandparents?
Yes. So I would say the grandparents are a big part of the grandchildren growing up. It's kind of part of an unwritten agreement that they kind of raise you with your parents as a help as well, because the parents want to or have to go to work. Not that I want to, probably they would want to stay with the kids. And if I think about it, my mom was looking for apartments always close to my grandma from the father's side. So let me call her Oma, just
Okay.
to make it like clear, because there are like two grandmothers, and in English there is no distinction between the paternal and maternal side. So I'll just call her Oma. That's the paternal side.
Sure.
And we moved a lot before I entered kindergarten. So we would always move close by to her, or at the last place that we moved to, my mom found a apartment for my grandma and my uncle below ours, so we would live in the same house. So that was even more practical for all of us, so we would be kind of all living together. And yeah, I would say it's very, very common if the possibility is there.
Wow.
Yeah.
Moving a lot in such a short amount of time, did you ever find out or understand why that was happening?
Yeah, my mom was looking for good neighborhoods as well as the best school to put me in. Best kindergarten and then best primary school. And in her eyes and in her mind, the best place to put me would be somewhere with the least amount of immigrants. Even though we are immigrants ourselves, obviously. But she was thinking, I have to be in a place where I can fully integrate learning the language, the culture, all of that. Yeah, so we would live somewhere and she would, within that time, look around the neighborhood, also the house that we would live in, and anything that she wouldn't like, she would be like, we're moving. Or she would go to a school, check that out, or just by living somewhere, you really feel the place, right? And the people around it and everything. And she would make decisions based on that. Yeah.
So you're saying that obviously, like your experience and relationship and connection with your grandma is just the way you saw it, like your grandmother. But when you were at the age before any kind of schooling, did you feel or recognize or notice that you were somewhere different and that something was different to the experience you were having in the home life? Because if you, as you described, with the natural culture and responsibilities of a grandmother or grandparent looking after the grandchildren and her world being quite insular, then did you know much of what was happening outside of your family structure?
I would say I really grew up in quite the Asian bubble because I wasn't aware that, I mean, probably I heard it, but my parents spoke German to other people, right? Maybe in a store or maybe even some neighbors. But as a child, you don't really register it, maybe. And I realized when I went to kindergarten that there is a whole world outside of the family world that is so cozy, loving, and safe. Yeah, it was quite harsh, that awakening, so to say, just to come to kindergarten and realize everyone is speaking another language. And obviously, kids are awful. They look at you, you look different, and they just see a target, right? So yeah, I was bullied most of the time in kindergarten. But thinking back, the worst thing about that wasn't the bullying for me, because felt like on the weekend I could just escape that, see my cousins, be together with them. But they would also bully my grandma that would pick me up from kindergarten.
Oh.
Mm.
So, did she know that that bullying was taking place?
Yeah, I mean, even if you don't understand the language, right? You see gestures, like, you hear the teasing in the kid's voice, and um, it was never really physical, like violent, but they would throw things at us and just, yeah, just not, it wasn't nice. And you could feel that even though you don't understand it. I mean, she didn't understand it, but after a while, I understood it, obviously. And she's a very peaceful Buddhist woman. So she was always like, oh, let it go, and barely would she be like, oh, just, say something back, or because in her eyes, that wasn't necessary.
Wow.
Mm.
And did you go to one kindergarten, or with all the moving around, you went to multiple?
That was one place. I think my mom realized that once enrolled in a place, it would be even more harmful to just pull me out of there.
Mm.
Even though, I mean, wasn't the best time ever, but sometimes, even if you want to, you might not be able to move.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, growing up in this bubble, you're surrounded by a completely different culture than the one that you're actually growing in the country you're growing up in. And not even knowing the language until you went to kindergarten, and then you were surrounded by it. And because you look so different, then the children automatically made fun of you and also your family. Did you learn the language straight away? Was there hesitation and a kind of doubt in your mind of even being there yourself, or was it just as you described, like being a child and just going with it?
Yeah, I think you just go with the flow as a child because you don't question it, right? And as a child, you learn languages quite quick.
Mm.
And I realized then why, my mom was being so careful with choosing the places, because probably she has experienced that herself in a different form when she came to Switzerland, because she was 12 years old or 13, and there were no integration programs back then.
Mm.
So she just got thrown into a class with peers her age without really being taught what's the difference between Swiss German and German. And same for me, though. I think for the first 2 years, I had a weird mix of both languages because no one really tells you the difference. You just pick things up enough to communicate, enough to understand. And when I went to primary school, I had extra German lessons with other immigrant children. Like, we had a lot of people in that area from Kosovo, Albania, or from Italy, from Macedonia. Yeah, so we had extra German.
Wow. So, by the time you've now entered primary school, how
Mm.
many languages are you speaking?
If you count Swiss German as a language itself, four. Yeah.
Wow. And what was your parent? Were you getting any feedback about how you were kind of assimilating, integrating, with school? Do you remember any kind of instructions your parents were giving you?
Not really, because I was doing quite well in school always. So I guess if they don't have to worry, they will not question things.
Mm.
So, because it's also new for them, right? And they were not the type of parents that would research and find out certain things about the whole school system. They were very trusting in the teachers and in the whole system, so to say. They are very grateful that we had this opportunity, right, to be there, to grow up there, to um, get education there and everything. So there wasn't questioning of it. And as long as I did well, there was like no news or good news.
Mm.
Mm.
And did the bullying continue going from kindergarten to primary school?
Yes, it did. I thought about it the other day because I was thinking like, oh, what will we talk about, right? And it actually continued until maybe fifth grade, but less during starting from third grade, because I had to change schools, like location of school, because the school was like expanding and moving and whatnot. And in that time, a Thai girl joined our class. She was 1 year older than us, but she went to a lower grade because she just came from Thailand and she had to learn the language. So she was probably in the situation that my mom was in, if I think about it now. But obviously, I didn't realize that back then. And she kind of taught me a lot of pride to be Asian. She was bringing back some games from Thailand. She brought like instant noodles for snacks into school. And she did Muay Thai. And she was just very secure in herself and loud in a good way, because she was a bit older, obviously. And yeah, I remember that was a really good time, actually, because I had another Asian kid in school. It was pretty nice, because my only other somehow Asian friend would be my seating neighbor that was Indian. And but it's a different experience, because he was a boy and had his friends and everything. So, yeah, kids can just be very cruel sometimes. But even though that time in school was then better, it I think it got overshadowed by some issues at home. Because then my dad lost his job. He was like tools mechanic, so he was welding little pieces or even bigger things for a company, and his job basically got replaced. So he got very angry and sad, started drinking a lot, and yeah, it was difficult at home. So if I think back at it, it's a blur, to be honest, that time. Yeah.
And did you have, up until that point where the Thai friend had now come to school, did you have many friends outside of school?
Not really, because I mean, as a kid, you don't really go out and socialize much elsewhere. My parents had some friends that would meet us on some weekends. Even we go to vacation with them, like classic summer vacation, driving down to Italy type of vacation. But you don't see them enough to be like, oh, that's your social circle. Plus, there was no social media back then, so you don't really keep in touch with other people other than the ones that are in your immediate proximity. Yeah.
Well, and just to clarify, how old were you when this Thai friend came across?
That was in third grade, so you're 10.
Oh, you're 10.
Yeah, I think 10, around that
Okay.
age. Yeah, 10, 11. Yeah.
Wow. So just to paint the picture, up until you're 10 years old, it was really the family unit. It was the navigation of the environmental factors that were happening around you, but it was going to school, there was bullying, there was isolation, meaning you were the only person of Asian heritage even around. And then when things started to turn and there was somebody else who was there and you felt comfortable with, then things took a turn at home. And so the discomfort, even to the point where there's not really much recollection of those times.
Yeah, now that I think about it, it's pretty sad. I really see like a gap there. Because after fifth grade, you have to decide, or no, sorry, the teacher will decide in what type of, there are three different grades, so to say, to split you up in, depending on your grades and how good you're doing in school. So I got separated from that Thai friend. And also another one that she used to be kind of my best friend, I would say. But she got put into a different grade, that when we went to that school, she was one of the bullies then. That was so weird because, in those three different stages or grades, you have like, the nerds, so to say, the ones that are good in school, and then the ones that are kind of in the medium, and then the ones that are a bit lower, and then they have different possibilities of work and education afterwards. So yeah, that it was that time where they would just bully the nerds. And yeah, she was then there and bullying me, and that was so hurtful.
Wow.
Thinking about it, yeah.
Wow.
And kind of try to find your place, right? You're like a confused teenager anyways in that time, pre-teen, not even teenager yet, and you just try to find your place in the world, and everything is just so confusing, and then you just try to get through with your grades. Yeah.
Wow. So first off, what did you do, because you're also an only child? It sounds like still at the home, the family unit was strong. And then, of course, you saw your family, your extended family, cousins, and everything on the weekends. First off, what was it like on your own, experiencing this on your own, and what did you do during the weeks? And then when you caught up with your family, your cousins, would you share your experiences? Would you connect in a different way? Was it a relief? Would you then not think about the weeks? How did it unfold?
Because my cousins were both younger than me, I would never share this experience with them because, first of all, they were too small, and also kind of needed or wanted to be the strong and like big sibling type of person, right? And I think the only person that really knew about the bullying were my parents and my grandma. And but what can they do, right? And you just kind of deal with it. You just try to ignore it. I focused on school, on my grades. You kind of just try to forget about it or not pay too much attention because you also get used to it. You get really blunt. You kind of just compartmentalize it in unconsciously. Yeah.
Do you think that they empathized? Do you think they understood through their own experiences?
I think so. Yes. And maybe that's why they were like, yeah, she needs to have her own experience because we went through it too.
I mean, it's phenomenal to think that from your grandmother to your parents to you, how different the experiences would have been. Moving, like your grandmother knowing everything and the whole culture and growing up in a completely different country and being a particular age where then you have to take your whole family and raise children in a completely foreign environment and not even speak the language, to then your mother being 12 years old and your father somewhat of a similar age, and then them just basically thrown into a school. And as you know, with like how cruel kids can be and have to learn so quickly, and then them wanting to give you the opportunities that they never had. But then by in doing so, there was a lot of isolation, and there was conscious choices to not put you in what they thought would be like the comfort of an international school. And so I've never been to Switzerland, but I could only imagine that, particularly even through all those times, those generations, that as you described, there wasn't much of a Vietnamese community.
Just on the weekends, right? Those events. But then it was fully Vietnamese. So you're in another bubble. It's just either, it was quite black and white if you think about it. I could only think of one instance where it was a little mix, where if I think of my dad's experience, it was a bit different than my mom's because he arrived in Switzerland when he was around 15, and he arrived in Interlaken. So that's like in the middle of Switzerland, quite touristic area now. He was in like a refugee camp and got adopted by the secretary that was working there, because that refugee camp was usually just for adults. And she was working there and was just empathizing with him because he was the only kid there. And she was like, how did he get here? Because he kind of smuggled himself on a boat and everything, or like acquaintances kind of put him there. And he wasn't supposed to be there. He wasn't supposed to be on that boat. So she had two young children herself, and she just adopted him in that sense, or fostered him. Sorry, that's the better word, because he stayed with them a bit more than a year, and after that, he was able to bring the rest of his family over, or like reunite with the rest of the family.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was the only different other Swiss touching point, so to say, with like another culture, because we would visit them once in a while, and that was even more countryside, but in a beautiful way, because where I grew up was still, it was a mix. It's a small town. You had sheeps and everything, but it was still kind of urban or like industrial, because you just somewhere where you can work and make money, right? It's not the romantic mountain gondola Switzerland that you imagine when you say and hear Switzerland.
Wow.
Yeah.
Did your family ever talk specifically about the escapes and what it was like on the boats?
It's really interesting that sometimes those topics would come up during family Christmas, family gatherings, but very casual. During dinner, they would kind of how do you say reminiscence in those memories, and they would say things like, "Oh, remember that time when you nearly got kidnapped by those pirates?" And we would just sit there and listen and like, what? Auntie nearly got kidnapped and or sold, or just random stories that would pop up, and everyone would have a different take on it, because my mom was number two of four, five siblings. So everyone was in a different age, had a different outlook or different experience of that whole travel ordeal, however you want to call it, right? Um, so it would be so different depending on who tells the story. But I think it is always very remarkable to hear how lighthearted they talk about it. Because if you say something like, oh, kidnapping, pirates, and stuff, you could imagine all kinds of cruel things happening, and on boats where you don't know what's the destination, or you stay on an island and you don't know how long, in a little camp, all temporary fixes. It sounds so dreadful, right? But because there were kids, preteens in those times, they had a great time.
Wow. Do you, were you proud of your culture growing up?
No, because I was bullied for it. I only started to have a little bit of Asian pride when that Thai friend came in. And then later on, when it was like a weird, not weird, interesting encounter in a train. It was like Russian photographer, and she was asking me if I would want to take portraits. So she would take some portraits of me, and then with that, I somehow got into portrait, like modeling, so to say, within like in Switzerland. And suddenly, those Asian attributes, face features, however you want to call it, were special and good, and I was praised for it. And that was something that slowly started that pride, so to say. But also, the time has changed, right? It was now, especially, it's suddenly cool to be Asian, but it wasn't in the 90s.
Mm. And with the age gaps of your cousins, did you, and I mean, first off, where did they grow up in retrospect to where you grew up? And then did you notice, because you were the oldest, the experiences or the differences within the experiences that they were having that you didn't or might not have had?
More afterwards, or now when we speak about it, I realize how different their experience was, because growing up and being in there, you never really question it. Or if you meet, when we met each other, we were too busy building pillow forts and having a good time with our other grandma that we wouldn't talk about these things. I wouldn't know how it looks for them or looked for them. Only now do I realize how different their experience was. Just growing up close to Zurich, which is more international, and they had different. They had Asian friends at school. They had mixed friends at school. It was much more diverse, and yeah, it didn't have to be an international school back then. Even you just had to be in a place that was a bit more international or a bit more open than a little small town in Basel-Land, which with sheeps and cows and everything.
Less sheep made all the difference.
Yes, yes. Even though they were quite cute.
Oh, wow. And so the final parts of high school,
Mm.
were they enjoyable for you?
I would say, let me think about the age, because I'm so bad with numbers. So I think, yeah, in high school, because you have to decide what you want to do when you're around 15, 16,
Mm.
right? Which is ridiculous. You gotta make a decision for the rest of your life at that age. You don't even know who you are. I mean, still don't really know sometimes, right? But um, in that time, I listened to the teacher that said, "Oh, your grades are good. You should go there and there," which was kind of prep years for university. But a lot of these people in that class in that year, they came from very rich families actually, and they had all the funds ready for when that time is ending, that those high school years. So they had like gap years and university money and all of that, and I realized, oh, that's not there for me, because my parents have separated by then. And right after that, my mom had a breast cancer diagnosis. So I felt very guilty still being in school, whereas others of my peers were already working because they did an apprenticeship. And I followed the recommendations of that teacher and prepped for university. So I was still in school. So I felt so guilty and useless to not contribute and have the ability to say, you can work less, mom, because I'm working too, right? Because I wasn't. And except from, like, vacation jobs or all of that, but obviously that's not enough to pay any bills. So that made me then rush into finding a job afterwards, because even though she recovered and everything, like after chemo she was working normally again, I still felt the need of, I need to be able to contribute. I don't want to just study. Yeah.
Mm.
Mm.
And how was the divorce and that navigating that for both you and your mum?
Thinking back, it was a beautiful time living just with her, because it got really difficult at home and very scary. And I remember telling my mom when I was 15, I was like, if you don't leave, I will when I'm 16. I don't know why. I think when you're 16, you were able to, I don't know, look for housing. I remember researching something and saying, oh, if you don't leave, I will,
Mm.
with 16. So not that I made the decision for her, but I definitely pushed her, or now, having had the opportunity to talk about it, I know that it was like a green light for her, because she wanted to leave, obviously, many years ago, but she thought she had to keep the family together for me. And until I was like, I'll leave if you don't. So,
And factoring obviously time, the timing, but in Vietnamese culture, is what's the relationship with divorce and what's the
unheard of.
wow.
My mom was always a bit of the black sheep and rebel in the family. And with that divorce, even more. All these regular family meetups, dinners with the whole Vietnamese side of the family, they got reduced drastically after the divorce. I barely saw my cousins in that time. I mean, it got less anyways because, of life and everyone, just being busy. But it got even less during that time. I had one last travel with my aunt from that time to go to my uncle's wedding in Vietnam. But yeah, I saw them very few times in that time, but also because they couldn't understand it, they were like, why would you do that? Like, to my mom, they would be like, why would you do that to your kid, to the family, all of that. Later on, a few years later, obviously that has all changed, or like their beliefs or their relationship to that. But it took a while, and it felt very isolating in that time.
Was the beauty that you said you experienced within the closeness you had with your mum?
Yes, and I just remember all the dinners we cooked together. I learned a lot of things, like how to cook in that time with her. Obviously, we were also fighting a lot because I was a teenager then, prime teenage years, so stubborn, so difficult. And she was obviously also stressed and everything, right? And yeah, but very beautiful. Mm.
Wow. Looking back on your childhood, how would you describe the whole experience?
Very, like the bubble, very safe and beautiful. The school world, scary and sad and isolating. So was a little double life back then already. But you can always find the good things, right? And if you have a beautiful, supporting family, that makes it much easier, right? Yeah, but we always were taught to just, be independent and stuff like this. So kind of just push through.
True, you don't know what you don't know sometimes, right?
Exactly. It's like only in the recent years where I, started to reflect back on that time, I would maybe realize certain things. But when you're in there, you just in there and you just see the beautiful things, or you try to, at least. Yeah.
Wow. And so you've now made the conscious choice you want to help your mum out more. So you, instead of going directly to university, you went into the workforce. And what exactly were you doing?
I started a traineeship, trainee, to be a trainee in a reinsurance company. And while I was working there, I also went to school to get a diploma and everything. But while I wanted to help her, I also felt the need to move out because, of like, kind of all the little fights and everything. And I just wanted to be on my own feet in some way. And also she has, like, back then it was her partner, but now husband. So I felt like it was also nice, for them to just be the two of them, right? So I moved out when I was 19 and just did that traineeship in Zurich, which was a bit more international. So I was more exposed to more international culture, I would say, within Switzerland, or just a possibility. But then also you enter workforce and you're going to school while you're studying, so you're so busy, don't even have really time to think about a lot. You just keep going. Yeah.
Did you feel you aligned to the Swiss culture?
I tried to. Because I remember my first visit to Vietnam was when I was around 7 years old, and I saw kids on the street. I saw a lot of poverty in Vietnam, and that was one of the moments where I realized how lucky I was.
Mm.
Right? We also went to a hospital to donate and to help out there, and just all the things that you see in that time, in those encounters, you just become aware of the privilege. So I felt like I needed to really try to fit in and to make it work and to not disappoint anyone, and just make it somehow, somewhat, however that looks, right? And then that just meant, for me in that time, finding work, or like good work, because office work also equaled success in our family. Because I remember being in the little, how do you call that, studio, when you do certain crafts, or like a shed
Mm-hmm.
of my dad back when they were still together. I told him I wanted to become a carpenter, and he was like, no way, you know the language, you have all the education, you have to go to the office, it's comfortable.
Mm.
you know so that was kind of the outlook on things and the belief around that. So I was like, okay, office, I need to become an office worker, that's good. Until you're there and you're like, I didn't hate it. I was really lucky. I was able to change internally and all, and I really liked my job actually, because I became an executive assistant. You have a lot of hats on as an assistant. You get to work a lot of different jobs and things, on a lot of different things, exposed to a lot of clients and whatnot, and it's very fun actually. But then you're like, at some point in time, personally, I was like, what for? Or, like, is that it? Obviously I got to have a lot of beautiful friends in that time, get to know a lot of people, but you just wonder, is that it? Am I working just to pay invoices? And what else is there?
Was it somewhat hard to ask yourself that question, knowing the privilege that you recognized?
Yeah, because I didn't know what else to do, right? Apart from obviously, like having those chances to travel during your fixed vacations and all of that. And those are those things that keep you seemingly happy, right? Because you go from one vacation to the other, or in my case, I had a lot of weekend activities and all of that, and you're just so busy, you barely have time to really think about it. That
Mm.
makes sense. Yeah.
And what was the percentage, if you were to guesstimate, of the people around you, workplace, socially, things like that, who were thinking outside of the box, who were kind of thinking outside of that structured, systematic approach of, all right, this is how everything unfolds, and you get this amount of time off, and you go do this and this. Was there many people thinking differently?
I wouldn't say so. Now thinking back at, certain environments and stuff, because it's quite just a very normal thing, and everyone thinks that's what you need to do to achieve happiness. And yeah, I'm just thinking about, different faces come to my mind now, different groups, and it's just everyone was just so happy with, those coffee breaks in the morning talking about your weekend and all of that. And I always felt a bit off in that time as well, because somehow I like had fabricated this double life where, during the week I would be in the office and everything, and on the weekend I had my a bit more alternative friends with, alternative like activities and everything, and all that portrait modeling I was mentioning
Mm.
before. And then I had certain friends being in like the BDSM scene.
Mm.
It just all led into, an alternative pathway of being more in the scene. And that's not something you necessarily can talk about during coffee break. So you kind of like, yeah, I had a good Easter weekend, yeah, and at the same time you were at an event called German Fetish Ball during the whole weekend, and it was just like, yeah, you know just very different life from the people that had like a mortgage and were talking about their ailments or like their bike tours on the weekend and everything. So
Mm.
yeah, quite interesting, and probably what kept me going for such a long time, because I had a different life outside of that.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean the dichotomy of the cultural and integrational experience you had in childhood now is kind of it's you're in the adulthood, the working life, and it also showcases the polarity between the worlds in which you were visiting and spending time within.
Yeah, and I kind of created it for myself, right? I was probably thinking, oh, I don't have it anymore from childhood. Let's make it up myself to just keep it interesting. I don't know.
Mm.
Wasn't on purpose, obviously, but it just happened.
And without, of course, ever knowing what it is like to be somebody else within this workspace. And he said, the conversations of maybe somebody's front lawn at the, in the kitchen of the office. Would you say overall, from what you could feel, were people happy with this life that was seems to be quite common?
I hope so for them. I wasn't, but I hope they were, just for their own sake.
Mm,
I wouldn't know. I couldn't reply for others,
sure.
right? But I've definitely heard some people questioning it, but also at the same time being trapped too much
Mm,
to even try to get out of it because of kids, mortgage, other family responsibilities. So difficult to really go if you want to, if you have so many responsibilities.
mm. Wow. Because, I mean, the reason why I asked this question is because, if a space or an environment is so good, then why would you ever question leaving?
Right.
And then wondering, deep down on a kind of emotional level, what percentage of people would want to even begin to question, and then the reality of how many people are not only questioning but actioning and
Mm.
changing their whole life,
Mm.
and particularly with you what you've shared so far and the sacrifices that were made in your family for generations to give you an opportunity and a better life to grow up in a country like Switzerland, but then for you to have your personal experience, but then still be strong enough to ask yourself not only those questions, when and what did you do to be able to sit with those answers?
I'd say I always kind of watched everything happening while I was, in that hustle and trying to achieve whatever next diploma. But I would say I remember particularly one moment where I was sitting on a bench at Lake Zurich. The lake was really glistening. It was looking really beautiful on that day. Postcard beautiful. Happy like bicycle riders, happy people walking, talking. And I was just sitting there and looking at the whole scenery, thinking that is gorgeous. That is so beautiful. People are dreaming to be here, have some type of work visa and whatnot. And I'm feeling miserable. I was feeling very sad, very trapped, so many different reasons. But then I can't blame anyone or anything that I wanted, right? But in that moment, I had this realization that it's most likely me, because I'm in this beautiful, gorgeous, picturesque place that people dream about coming to, and I'm so unhappy and I'm so miserable. So I have to leave or do something, right? And that thought of leaving obviously wasn't easy because my whole family is there. Don't want to seem ungrateful, all of these things, right? Because this great gratitude was so instilled in our family in many different ways. So I didn't want to seem ungrateful, right? Or all the possibilities or the sacrifices that you've mentioned that have been made, I don't want them to think that it was in vain or that I would throw that away or whatever. But it had to happen, and I made it happen, and I left Switzerland before my 30th birthday and haven't been back since. I have to go back for visits though, but I don't intend to go back to live there. Yeah.
Did your family, first off, how did you bridge that and share that news with your family? And what was their initial response, and did they believe you?
Well, in that time, the working holiday visa for Swiss people has opened up in Australia. So I packaged, I mean, I didn't know back then when I left that it would be for so long. So it was packaged as a kind of working holiday visa, sabbatical adventure thing, right? But I left my job, I canceled the apartment contract, sold most of my things. There's still like a little corner in my auntie's basement left with some of the things that I don't even know anymore what's in there, if I'm honest. But yeah, I made all the necessary steps, right, to save in that time before leading up to it, but then to really leave. Yeah.
And I mean, what did you know about Australia?
It's gonna be hot, some kangaroos out there. But I arrived in August in Melbourne and it was very cold. So I had to buy a jacket. Didn't know much. I just went for it, right? And did the classic, working holiday experience with like the farm work and all. Yeah, and that set me up for the second year because you can prolong when you go to do farm work and all. And then I did a yoga teacher training after talking to a friend on the beach that did one in Sri Lanka. So I decided and found a beautiful place in Thailand, an island, to do it there. And yeah, one thing led to another, and I suddenly had this dream of teaching yoga on an island. And working 4 different jobs in Australia, I saved up enough money to then just go for it. And before that, going to India and learning more. But all these things happened seemingly in such a short amount of time. But I felt like the moment I left Switzerland, the moment I left that golden cage, so to say, that so many things just opened. And I feel like I've lived a lifetime in that short time just by expanding my thoughts in the sense of what's possible. Like all these thoughts that I already had, but still try to fit in somehow. There was no cage left or no hurting anymore within that um, system. So it just felt so freeing. And I think even though everyone from the family was quite skeptical and scared or worried, they then saw how happy I was. Yeah.
And what time or how long was that period for you to witness and for your family to see, wow, this is the path that she's meant to walk, or we accept the choices that you have made?
I think it's still, depending on which family member you would ask, it's still ongoing. I was, I would say when I think about it, it's my mom, biggest supporter, always very lucky to have such, modern mom, so to say, that is just so supportive in every way. And we would video call every week. We would see each other more on video call than we would have living in the same country. So she saw how happy I was just being away, right? Nothing, it wasn't anything personal, obviously, she knows that. But seeing me so happy then for her made it clear that, it's fine, it's safe, it's the right thing. Yeah.
Wow. It's so beautiful to think that by following your path and your heart, it actually brought you closer because of, modern technology, but just being so genuine
Mm.
and being true to that.
Yes, absolutely.
It's incredible to think that even with what we perceive as, alignment or structure or security around us, and particularly if it's so heavily adapted by a culture, to really take that time of not only personal introspection but inner questioning about where your happiness really lies, and what is the connection to the path that you feel more called to walk. And there are certain countries in this world that are set up in that way of what you describe as a golden cage more than any. And I think that the circumstances in which you grew up within that, it's incredibly brave and honorable for you to have stepped out, chose and actively chosen that for yourself. Because I imagine that it is so well established and set up for people to never even consider leaving.
Yeah, thank you. I think for many, of course, especially when I talk to friends or even my cousins, right? I think that's why I like to use the word golden cage, because obviously it's not a bad time in there. It's beautiful. You can get anything that you want. Like I was earning more money in my early 20s than my parents did, like salary wise, at a later age because of my education. But yet, even with all the gadgets I could buy, with all the clothing, with all the fun things I could do with money, all the travels, there was something else missing for me personally. And especially when I quit everything and there was no stable income anymore, but I was feeling still so happy about everything. I was like, oh, I don't need a regular and safe salary to be happy in that sense. Obviously, sometimes it's a bit stressful, or, it would be nice, to always know how much comes in or whatnot. But at what price? And especially when I went to India and had a little reconnection to my spiritual path that was paved, luckily and fortunately, by my grandma, it was even more evident that I cannot go back to it, and I don't want to, right? But yes, for sure, it's so comfortable and so beautiful, and especially if everyone else is like, oh, you're so lucky, I wish that or this, and then you feel even more guilty to leave things behind, right? Because you're like, oh, but that's someone else's dream. But I think that was one of the lessons too, right? Just because it's someone else's dream or your parents' dream, your grandparents, doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right thing for you.
Wow, beautifully said. In saying that, Jess, I thank you very much for sharing your story here today. And within that very personal message, we move on to now the part of the podcast that comes to your medicine. So, looking back and all that you've experienced and all that you have understood from the journey within, what do you think has been your greatest medicine or teacher on this path?
I feel like that has been all just the beginning. But what I've learned so far, I would say that to not do things for others because society thinks it's the right thing or your family thinks it's the right thing, but ask yourself, is that what you want? But then at the same time, when you do something, always do it with good intentions, with with love, so to say, and then everything else is gonna align, right? Everything else is gonna fall into place for you if you just have good intentions while you're doing it.
Very beautiful. Well, thank you for your time and sharing your story here today.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Wow, how incredible to hear such a resilient and beautiful story from Jess. I think that putting yourself in the situation of early childhood and experience and growing up not like anybody else without, of course, really giving it too much thought or consideration because as we discussed in the podcast, you don't know what you don't know. But familiarity is something that a lot of people continue to maintain throughout their whole existence. But I was really sitting with the feeling of what it must have been like when you grow up and not much is familiar to self at all. And having the bond and the connection of the family unit, but it's still being only on the weekends and within the household. And what it must have looked like to have a particular cuisine at home, but then see people eating very different things outside, maybe at school and in the local restaurants and cafes. I believe that variety is the spice of life, but it is also nice when we are or have a say within that variety, and we can measure and add and subtract how much we want. But a lot of times when you're thrown into a space of dichotomy and not having much choice within it, then it really just leaves room for a lot of navigation to be done. And I really try to put myself in the situation of what it would have been like generationally for Jess's grandmother, grandparents, parents, and herself and her cousins. I mean, even just being a refugee, leaving the country and the origin that you know so well, and the only thing that you knew, to then risk your life and also risk your family's life, end up in a refugee camp in a completely different country waiting for some kind of outcome and not knowing. And at that time, I mean, people getting from Vietnam and refugees were getting sent all around the world, depending on, as Jess said, where you're from or family conditions. And to land in Switzerland, a country that I've only ever seen from photos, but what I can only imagine would be incredibly far removed from Vietnam. I see and feel so much resilience in Jess, but in a very beautiful and optimistic way. Being bullied for such a long time, I think, really would make or break somebody. And when it breaks somebody, whether it's not just physical, in a way of harboring an incredible amount of resentment, or making somebody in the way in which I believe is more coming from radical acceptance and knowing that you can't change other people nor want to. All you can do is focus on yourself. And there comes a resilience with that too, and a flair and spice for life. Because when it's really embodied, I feel you can see it, you can feel it. It's this carefree nature of almost nonchalance, but this confidence at the same time. And it's beautiful to witness and inspiring to see, because it's a different way to dance through life. There's less cares. It's almost like you've done your time. People have been unkind and you haven't let it affect you, or you've sat with it and you've seen and supported yourself, which is the most important thing. And I also tried to imagine what it would have been like first for her family to have the eldest of all the children come and say that she wants to move away. And not only just around the corner, but to the other side of the world, and go explore and adventure and leave everything that she had known in the golden cage, as she described, behind. And then, most importantly, what it was like for Jess to have those thoughts, those feelings, those beliefs and understanding that she knew deep down what was right for her, and following that. Because I think that we all hear the whispers, but it's whether or not we choose to listen to them. Because it's like the writing on the wall. Once you see it, you know that there is work that is required to make that happen. But it's when it comes with complete alignment, it doesn't feel like work. It feels like destiny, that it was fated, that there is no other way, in fact. It's just about staying true to who you are and knowing that it will, in fact, all work out. So beautiful to hear the support of her mum and the rebel that she was, that inner fire, and passing that on to Jess in so many beautiful ways. And embarking finally on that journey and what it's like to choose to stay at home on all those social nights to save a little bit of extra cash and say no, because every little bit counts. And once you're gone, you know you're gone. And the stories and the teachings of the roads will reveal themselves as they do. I think the most powerful part is when you actually take that step and leave what you know is all familiar behind and embrace the unknown. I very much enjoy listening to Jess's story on so many different levels. hearing the strength, the courage, the bravery, the optimism, the wisdom, integrity, and the approach and spontaneity of life and the alignment to this world. So I thank Jess very much for sharing her story, sharing what it must have been like and what it was like to grow up in within the circumstances in which she did, and to now be proud of her culture and to have really adopted so much of the beauty within it. So I give thanks and I deeply commend the journey that Jess has embarked on. There you have it, how one woman's story of seeing things for what they were brought more connection to her life and her family than if she walked the road most traveled. If you'd like to see more of Jess's world, head to @chi.ai.nhi. As a therapist, I specialize in men's mental health, but more importantly, creating the right environment for someone to get to know themselves on a deeper level. Getting to know the parts of yourself you haven't yet fully seen means there is nothing darkening the bright future ahead of you. So if you're looking to shine more light on the future ahead, head over to @Taylor_Jardine or plumplains.com. My name is Taylor Jardine, and this is Your Story, Your Medicine. Thank you for taking the time to listen.